says, as I read Tolkien's scholarship on the Second Age and reread Lord of the Rings, the more I come to appreciate Rings of Power in my rewatch. The showrunners and everyone involved in the process have really achieved something special. I've truly experienced Middle Earth in this recent viewing. Um, this is going to be very interesting to me because Chris and I are getting ready to rewatch The Rings of Power in August to prepare for the season two, which I think is August 28th or 29th or something like that. And for those of you who were here when my channel first started blowing up and I got monetized in the height of like that first Rings of Power trailer coming out of the Super Bowl and my reaction to that getting like 50,000 views and that being like my first ever viral video. And then we did a whole summer of Rings of Power discussions. We did the Lord of the Rings read through, the history of Middle Earth. We did Mondays of Middle Earth, sorry, is what we called it. We did all the Lord of the Rings chapter by chapter, and then we did some of the Silmarillion. It took about 2 years to do all of that, and then I covered, the first season of Rings of Power, and I had critiques. The Tolkien fan in me critiqued that show at like a 2 out of 10. But then the general fantasy viewer in me watched it with my wife, who has never read the books, and Chris gave it an 8 out of 10. And I would probably score it like a 6.5 or a 7 out of 10 on a total generic fantasy level. But they did have aspects of it that were faithful to Tolkien-esque ideas and things. As an example, there is a song that the two Harfoot girls sing when they're going out on their adventure, right? And they're going across, and it's just like all these massive wide shots of the New Zealand countryside as these two little hobbit girls go skipping through the countryside, and they're singing this song about the country life and wandering and everything else. And it was a song that was created for the show, and it felt very Tolkien-esque. It felt like it fit and belonged in Middle Earth. The music was very well done. The scenery, it was all very well done. So there were aspects of um, the Rings of Power that I think, you know, do hearken to the showrunners at the very least having, or the showrunners, but just all the people involved. There is a passion for Middle Earth there, even if it's not the vision that I share. And I do agree with Raymond Feist, who is the author of the Rift Force saga. He's fairly active on his Facebook page, although he's less active now that he's getting older, but he's been very vocal about um, adaptations being made and how no one sets out to make a bad adaptation. The reality is just that the version of the characters that I see in my head is different from the version that you see in your head, and it's different from the version that he sees in his head as the author of things. And so at the end of the day, everyone has a different version in their minds of what the interpretation is for something. And the worst thing you can do as a fan is try to dictate that your vision is the only way something is allowed to be portrayed. And that's the beauty of adaptations is anybody who has the money to buy the rights and adapt a property into a different medium, whether it's television, film, theater, audio plays, audio books, fan fiction, whatever the case may be. If you have the money to get a licensed deal to make an adaptation, you get the right to make a version of the adaptation and interpretation that you have in your mind. And that is something that we should celebrate because not every author allows their work to be adapted. And I'm always going to err in favor of I would rather see more of something than not anything of that at all. Here's another good example. The Rohirrim film is coming out, I believe, this fall. This fall, isn't that the Ride of Rohirrim that's coming out this year? And they just started sharing the. I haven't done a reaction video to it yet. I just got back home a couple of weeks ago, and it's on my list of things to cover, as well as the upcoming um, Shire game that Tales of the Shire or Tales of the Hobbit, I forget what it's called. Weta Workshops is doing their very first ever. It's Tales of the Shire. They're doing their very first ever cozy crafting game, and it's coming out, and it's Tales of the Shire. So I'll be doing a reaction video around that as well. But the point I'm getting at is, if you look at the art style for the Rise of the Rohirrim or the Ride of the Rohirrim, whatever that movie's called, it's the Castlevania team who just did Castlevania for Netflix, and so it has a very anime style, Eastern anime style as opposed to Western anime style. And some people have looked at that and immediately they have said, "I'm not going to watch that because that art style looks like shit." And I think to myself, well, if you were actually a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien and you were actually a fan of Middle Earth and you actually love all things Lord of the Rings, you would watch that film and celebrate it regardless of the art style because what we're getting is more Middle Earth. And we didn't get that when I was a kid. We didn't have all these shows and films and video games and tabletop games and comic books and all this other stuff. None of that. We didn't get anything. It was literally Christopher Tolkien pushing out a History of Middle Earth book every now and again, and that was it. We got jack shit as far as like television and film and video games were concerned. Well, maybe not so much video games, but definitely television and film. That was, you know, between Bakshi's version in the 70s and Peter Jackson's versions in the early 2000s, we had a 25-year drought of nothing in terms of film and television stuff. So I'm always going to prefer to see more of, even if I don't necessarily agree with all the art styles. And Tales of the Shire is another good example. That game um, has a very unique, matter of fact, Tales of the Shire. I spelled it wrong. Doesn't really matter. But Tales of the Shire, very unique, very different art style here. Let's turn the audio down on this really quick. And you could see, I mean, we're going to do a reaction video to this at some point. I am going to be playing the shit out of this game when it goes live, by the way. But it's a very, there, that's a good example of it right there. That's a very good, it's a very cutesy, artsy, crafty game. And I'm going to play it. I don't think it's the best art style. Who cares? It's more Middle Earth, and I think that that's something that should be celebrated. So even if you don't agree with um, the Rings of Power, we should celebrate the fact that Rings of Power has brought more Middle Earth into our lives, even if you don't agree with all of the decisions they make when they're adapting. Pick says, I went to see the Shire last year. It was so beautiful. That's awesome. I'd love to go, but it's just not something I'm not going to. I'm not wealthy enough to afford to go. For Chris and I to go at the moment. I've priced that out, and for us to go for like, even if we were just to go for like 1 week, which we usually try not to go anywhere unless we're able to go for months at a time, which is why we haven't traveled in several years because once we bought the homestead, we used to. So, for those of you who don't know, my job before this was I spent about a decade in the travel industry as a travel photographer, travel writer, travel blogger, travel influencer. And so Chris and I went all over the world and did lots of projects. There's a whole resume that you can go look at if you want more information on that. And the big thing that we focused on was immersion travel. So we did a lot of blogger residencies for tourism boards where they would bring us in. We would stay for months at a time in a destination and we would fully cover that destination, 2 weeks in this place, 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 a month here. And we would move around within a region and just fully cover it with blog posts, videography, filmography, photography, and articles for clients, and so on and so forth. And so we try not to go anywhere unless we can actually spend some time on the ground, even just to go for like a week. The last time I checked, price of flights and hotels and everything else, it was going to be like a minimum of $10,000, and it was like I'm not spending 10 grand to go on a week long vacation. That just seems like an absolute, I could buy a car for 10 grand. So um, when I used to do it for work, it was different because that's a write off and that's a work expense. So it's totally makes sense to go do it because you're getting that as a tax write off at the end of the year. But when it's just for purely leisure, I have a hard time spending 10 grand on something because it's just like oof. So we have not yet made it to New Zealand. There's really only 3 places that are on our bucket list of places we'd still like to go. Chris really wants to go to Japan and Egypt. And I do really want to do New Zealand at some point. So I'm sure it'll happen at some point, in the next few years. But it's also, we can't really travel right now because of our cats and the chickens and the homestead and everything else. At least not for extended periods of time. I mean, I just went up for 3 weeks to the US and on a work trip, but Chris stayed home and took care of the cats and the chickens and everything else. I mean, we've got 25, 30 chickens, 8 cats. It's not something where we could just pick up and go now. It's like you can't just put them in a kennel, and you can't just have people come over. It's complicated. Um, anyway,